Hi, I'm David Siders, and I'm pretty much from the Cincinnati area. For most of my adult life, I've lived downtown Cincinnati because it was, in the 90s and the 2000s, the gay mecca downtown, and I'll talk more about that later. My pronouns are he, him. I identify as a gay queer man. Well, part of my background is when I was a kid, my family, we lived in Mount Washington, a suburb of Cincinnati, and my family wanted to get away from the city, so they bought a farm in rural Claremont County. So I grew up in a rural area, which maybe I'll talk a little bit more about later, but it was difficult because I knew I was gay as early as 13, I think, 13, 14, early adolescence. And I was introverted, but also very expressive. I was a band geek, and a lot of us were outcasts and misfits. So I would say a good part of my growing up was supportive in a safe environment with people around me in band and in the creative arts. But I also experienced bullying. It was definitely a low point in the 80s when bullying was common, at least in my experience in school, and our school administrators and teachers really didn't have our backs and do much about it. In high school, I actually went through some mental health challenges and started to see a professional that helped coach me how to become out to my parents. So I'm grateful when I reflect on that I actually had a little bit of support and structure around me. And I came out and I still remember the conversation with my parents at age 16. Yeah, my parents were very supportive, but it was also a time that, for me, I still felt kind of protected. I felt out and expressive and happy about being gay in my own life, but I also felt like I just had to be careful and a little bit inward, especially around kind of the sports type people in my high school, and when I'd be out and about. It was a challenge to sort of turn on and off your feelings or your feelings of expression at that time. And on that note, I'm just so relieved that our world has evolved to a point with so much more acceptance. But I also look back at the time of being grateful for the support I had, the love of my parents, the love of my band geek friends. I have some of the best memories. And after all these years, some of the kids that actually bullied me in high school friended me on Facebook after all these years. So I was kind of like, what? But I did friend them, and I just believe in love and forgiveness, and just trying my best to understand the world around me. My impression of the city of Cincinnati is a little bit complicated. I work in a public institution that for years has been diverse. I've worked around people different than me, that what I prefer. And that's what I prefer. I love living and working around people different than me, so I can listen and hear other people's lived experiences. So I feel like I might be a little bit biased in regard to my workplace being more diverse and supportive of me being queer. And then living in downtown Cincinnati, I actually lived in an apartment building that was completely diverse, age-wise, identity-wise. There were drag queens, there were elderly folks. It was just this Belle Epoque, this utopia. Unlike downtown Cincinnati today, that everybody wants to live here, it was a time that when business hours shut down, sort of the gay life turned on in the evenings. And I lived on Court Street, and Court Street was our own gay mecca. There were a number of gay bars that we'll probably get into talking about a little bit later. But it was just this magical world of being able to be yourself, being around people different than me, but feeling part of a community at the same time. I know over the years there's been sort of this rivalry between downtown and north side, and I think centered around the Pride Festival and Parade. I loved it all. I think, I'm not remembering exactly, but my first involvement in Pride, in the Pride Parade, was in Northside. I remember gathering at Mount Storm Park and then marching down through Northside, and it was really, really joyous. And at one point I remember I was actually volunteering for a person running for public office. And I remember waving the pride flag as part of this, promotion of getting someone elected that was gay friendly and supportive of our LGBTQIA plus communities. And it was really joyous. Since I lived downtown, when the parade moved from Northside to downtown, I was fine with it because I knew both sides and I loved both sides. But living in the city, it was just a joy to have Pride initially, and then seeing it grow over the years. And then Pride last year, we had the pandemic that shut down, was one of the most massive experiences in terms of numbers of people and diversity that I've seen in all the years past. So I see the community as supportive in general, but I'm also very aware of hardships that people have experienced. I'll never stop thinking about some of the earliest photographs of Pride celebrations on Fountain Square, where individuals in the parade or marching or kind of protesting or being activists on the square would wear paper bags over their head, and that actually makes me really sad to think of that time. So I'm very mindful and intentional of my experience and the joy that I felt and the communities that I had around me, but I certainly acknowledge folks before me or even during my time that didn't feel the same way in the city. I've been called faggot a number of times in the city, but when I look back on it, it's been relatively few times. So I just treasure the tolerance, the acceptance that I've had in the people in the community around me, but I certainly acknowledge any hardships that other folks might have had along the way. I moved downtown Court Street, oh my gosh, late 90s, if you can believe that. And like I've mentioned, there were so many fun spots downtown, and when business hours were over and any evening would wear on, the gay life would come out. There would be just people around, and the bars were full. And I was pretty young then, so it was, again, not to overuse the word magical, but it was such like an everyday experience, obviously, especially on weekends. And I just thought of one of the coolest things, the drag races that originated on Court Street. It was pretty organic, and I think it was Shooters and Pipeline when it just started happening. And I would literally walk out my front door. I think they were either a Saturday or a Sunday afternoon, and it was like an instant celebration and an instant party, and it was hilarious because all the participants were in heels or in costume, very expressive, very joyous, and just running down the street was the most fun experience, and I really believe it was one of the most innovative kinds of efforts in LGBTQIA communities that I knew of, at least at the time. I felt really proud that Cincinnati had this kind of niche subculture of celebration and this bonding and support of everybody. And it grew and it grew, and I think it grew to include Dykes on Trikes, which was really fun. So it grew into something more for everybody, and then I would see family members and folks coming in to join the fun. Oh my gosh, I'm just actually thinking kind of geographically downtown. Spurs was on the east side of downtown. We mustn't overlook the legacy of Carol's Corner Cafe. I was still pretty young in my early 20s, but friends from my workplace and other friends would go there all the time after work, on weekends.
Where was Carol's?
Carol's was on Main Street, sort of Main and 9th Street, next to where the main event is now. And Carol was an illustrious figure. She was a performer and would actually sing kind of cabaret style. But talk about community. Carol's Corner Cafe was just an assemblage of people from all walks of life and backgrounds and ages. But it was a queer bar. It was definitely a gay vibe. And it was a restaurant too, so delicious food. But every time you went, there was just some special feeling in the air. It was a feeling of inclusion. It was a feeling of love, good food, good drinks. You would bump into people you knew, and then Carol would come out in like a feathered boa and just kind of mingle with everybody. And when I reflect on those days, it's hard to believe they're all over because they were so active back then, just so much to do. Spurs closed, Carol's closed, and as we move over to the west side of downtown, there was Shooters, which was kind of a country western bar theme that had drag shows, and that actually lasted a long, long time. And then the Pipeline was across from City Hall, which I always thought was really cool. And Pipeline was there was a basement level that was its own unique experience, and then first floor bar. And one of the happiest memories is some of my friends would DJ there on particular nights at the Pipeline. And this was sort of getting into the 90s when shoegaze and Britpop was popular. And that bar kind of had a vibe of kind of the newest music happening in town and multiple DJs and that kind of thing. Then later on, we gained on Vine Street near Vine and Court. It was first Hamburger Mary's, which was a national chain, and it just sort of came out of the blue, and it was such a fun concept. And it had that same, Carol's I believe was closed by then, so the big meeting spot for a restaurant and bar was Hamburger Mary's. And I met new people there. We always saw friends there. We would make a point to hang out there. And then at that point, I was getting a little bit older, and these places were getting really crowded. And I wasn't kind of less interested in crowds. So I would go at different times. And that was a part of the magic of living downtown, is I could stop in after work before it got really crowded and just kind of find my place of comfort in these establishments. But again, I think the overriding theme is the city belonged to all of us because we didn't have the en masse or the critical mass of residents now, and it just felt like it was a queer world that belonged to all of us. I just thought of another place that I can't believe I haven't mentioned yet. When I was a late teen, the most amazing bar, one of the most amazing bars and nightclubs was the Metro and the alleyway now across from the Aronoff Center. The Metro was a 2-level establishment. The first floor had a stage and a super large movie screen. And if you think back in the late 80s and 90s, that technology wasn't even around. So to have videos, and MTV was still very popular, and I'll never forget seeing Grace Jones' Slave to the Rhythm on that huge screen. And it was just amazing. And then the other thing, very special thing about the Metro is the artist and performer Scirocco. The Metro was the first place that I saw Scirocco. And I have a very close friend that's passed now, but he was friends with Scirocco for decades. So I got to meet her along the way, and then I met her before she passed, which I consider a very special gift because Scirocco was a gift to the city of Cincinnati and to our region. The things I know about Scirocco are a little bit limited. She was, in my eyes, a little bit mysterious, which was part of the allure. She would just kind of show up at these shows and have this magnetism. And I remember another bar that I haven't mentioned yet was the Dock, of course. And I would go there. It was a little bit too large for my taste, but I do remember some great times. But I remember some fabulous performances of Scirocco at the Dock. And the Metro and the Dock were the first two experiences that I had in seeing drag shows, and it's unforgettable. In my mind, Scirocco was a drag queen and illustrious performer, more than a drag queen because of her presence in so many different places, and just filling my memory with just being, and I'm not dismissing drag whatsoever, but just larger than life figure that so many people admired. The really cool thing about the Metro was it catered to new wave folks and punk folks. That's where I first experienced new wave music. I mentioned Grace Jones and Slave to the Rhythm. All of the new wave hits, New Order, the Smiths, Eurythmics, all the bands, new wave bands that you can think of, Depeche Mode. Those videos played downstairs, but upstairs was the late night dance club. Lights were low, it was dark, but we had the best DJs up there. And this is early on in the new wave movement. Punk rock had happened before, but the DJs at the Metro would have European remixes of all of these songs. And we heard the songs on the radio or saw them on MTV, but when you were in a nightclub such as the Metro and they had these remixes, it was just this magical period of creativity. So the Metro catered to people that were very new waved out, spiked hair and asymmetrical hair, 80s clothes, which are all coming back now. And there was definitely a punk rock element there too, so you would see the Liberty spikes and that kind of thing. The other really cool thing about the Metro is they created a monthly magazine called DV8, and it was all about self-expression. So there would be poetry, there would be editorials, there would be fashion layouts, like photographs of fashion shows, and then music criticism and that kind of thing, and then events calendar for the LGBTQIA plus community. So it really catered to everybody, but it had that really cool vibe of new wave and punk. Yeah, when I think about particular bars or establishments that catered to different demographics or people on the whole wheel of the LGBTQIA plus experience, I do remember two particular lesbian bars in Clifton, and I'm not remembering their names. One was on Calhoun Street, and the other was on North Vine, almost at the top by McMillan Street there. And I had friends, I had lesbian friends that would take me there, and it was so fun. It was so great because it was inclusive, but it was, owned by lesbians and run by lesbians and appealed to lesbians. So that was a very interesting niche and time, and I'm honestly very sad that that's gone away. I think people feel, at least for me, a little bit mixed about having bars that welcome everybody with a queer vibe versus, hey, this is for queer people to celebrate their queerness. And I've seen that transition over time. I don't have super strong feelings about that because I value the fact that our allies are willing to come out in an open space and support and celebrate everything. But I also wonder what the world would be like if we did have some bars that were more specific for people's identity and what they identify with. It's an interesting question, and I just don't really have a solid answer on how I feel. But I definitely saw the lesbian bars, to my knowledge, go away, which I was sad, and I saw kind of the needle tilt to more general establishments that welcomed everybody, but had the queer undertone to it. I had an older friend that's deceased now, and he would tell me the best stories about the earliest gay bars or queer bars in Cincinnati. One was down by 4th Street and Plum, called the Badlands. And I actually, I was pretty young, but I went to a New Year's Eve event there. But it was one of those establishments that was definitely secretive. You had to know about it. But back to my older friend and his stories, there was an establishment, and I believe it was called Talk of the Town, that was for Black and African American people. Welcomed all people, but my friend would go and just meet some of his favorite people that became longtime friends. He would talk about the vibe, the lack of racism in it, the lack of homophobia in it, and in this establishment. And it's just fascinating early on how there can be an establishment with that much unity, but at the same time, it makes me sad that they had to keep quiet and be secretive for their safety. So I really think about this establishment and what it would have been like. And if we could have some establishments like that where people can really embrace their identities or their lived experiences. Yeah, well, I can't resist talking about Crazy Lady's Bookstore. I lived downtown at the time, and I was so downtown centric, I didn't get to North Side a lot back then, but I had friends that worked there. One of my closest friends now worked there back in the day and tells me amazing stories of the solidarity and the unity and the diversity of thought within women's liberation and lesbianism and all of the themes of the materials and books that the Crazy Ladies Bookstore carried. And what a special gift to our city to have that longevity. And I hope and I think that some of those materials and maybe promotional materials are part of the Ohio Lesbian Archives now. But that is one place that I remember being a little bit more informal and obviously open all day kind of thing, where people could stop in and feel safe while they're exploring their gender identity or queerness. I want to talk about my building, the apartment building I lived in, because we would hang out together in each other's apartments, and it would be a mix. Not like an instant party, but there would be some straight hetero friends, some queer friends, and older folks that I admired that were sort of like mentors to me. There was a friend called Bobby Corbin that had the most amazing fashion thrift store on Court Street. And Bobby lived in my building, and we would just hang out, talk about her life being an African American woman. She lived in Denmark in the 70s. I met her through shopping at her thrift store, and it was all this glamorous, vintage clothing, hats, and accessories, just total self-expression, just a wonderland of style and fashion. And then when I moved into my building and learned that she lived there, we didn't spend a whole lot of time together, but we would all mix and mingle in our apartment building in a casual setting with lots of love and lots of acceptance. Yeah, Carto and Leslie was a really cool store. It was a frame shop, art restoration store, and a vintage collectible bookstore. And my former partner at the time helped run that store. And we had the most amazing events there. We had bands play. We had art exhibits. One of the most amazing, memorable exhibits, and I was so privileged to be able to help with it, was the Frisch marionettes. And all of these marionettes were handmade. And Frisch marionettes are still active today, so please check them out. But the marionettes were famous, mostly literary characters. So there was Oscar Wilde, there was Emily Dickinson, there was Virginia Woolf. The clothing was handmade. The marionettes were handmade. I think Winston Churchill was there. I think maybe Margaret Thatcher. But it was a meeting ground for creatives too, and it definitely had a gay vibe to it as well.
How long was that open?
I would say about 8 years, if I can remember correctly. And it started in a smaller spot, and it grew, and it was pretty popular.
What
Oh, goodness. I would say Carto and Leslie opened probably about 2003 to maybe 2001 to 2008 or 9, something like that. I'm not really good with my dates exactly, but in that range, early 2000s. Well, when we talk about Carto and Leslie, I do have to mention how Hamburger Mary's kind of morphed over time. And was it Universal Grill was the next iteration of that? And that was a lot of fun. And I met a lot of people there. And every time I would go, I would see friends. And that was right around the corner for me. So that was part of that feeling that downtown belonged to gay, lesbian, queer, LGBTQIA people too. And I was very sad when that closed, but then it morphed into Below Zero, which had such a deep impact and legacy on all of this. And that was sort of my second round of visiting and experiencing drag, because the cabaret developed upstairs, and actually a number of the queens lived in my apartment building. So that was actually another era of living in this building with drag queens who I came to know and love, and some are still very active in the community. And there was actually a time when we worked together to do a couple of drag performances on Fountain Square. I was involved with a particular group that was organizing events on Fountain Square, and I think we did at least 2 years of drag shows on Fountain Square. Yeah, that was really a special time as well. The cabaret, after a while, would get so crowded. I was still moving into that space where I was kind of a little bit hesitant about big crowds too. But I would go fairly regularly to that, and there was so much expression, there was so much love, there was so much diversity, creativity, and the performances were just amazing. I think the transition from the 80s to the 90s in terms of the queer experience was somewhat extreme from my experience, and I was very young, but the 80s did have that feeling of, yes, you could be expressive inside a club or inside my apartment building and that kind of thing. But I definitely remember, well, first of all, the AIDS quilt and ACT UP and all of that kind of thing, when on a national level, queer visibility was definitely increasing because of the tragedy of the AIDS epidemic, sadly. But I also saw locally and nationally more understanding, more acceptance and tolerance as we moved closer to the 90s. I actually have seen the proclamation that Mayor Jerry Springer wrote to honor gay and lesbians, and it's kind of dated language now. And I think that was 1977, so I know I'm digressing here a little bit. But it's very fascinating to think about 1977 and a decree by the city to support gay and lesbian people. Then we moved to the 80s. And in my experience, as I've been talking about feeling a little more guarded or a little bit split, like guarded on an everyday basis, but feeling very expressive in all of these clubs and entertainment venues. So kind of a little bit one extreme to the other. Then in the 90s, it kind of leveled out a little more, but I was getting into my later 20s at that point too. So maybe I was having more comfort in my own skin and my own identity. But that's when it got to the point, like, at the Pipeline, when we had the shoegaze music and the Britpop music, how it was just becoming a little bit more open for people to express themselves in these kind of entertainment venues. And then when we moved to the 2000s and the social media came on board in the later, 2000s, everything blew up and everything started to change. I started to see same-sex couples holding hands. I never had a problem holding the hand of my boyfriend at the time when it got into the 2000s and that kind of thing. So it became pretty radical. And then the parades in Clifton for Pride were very, very large. But I remember sort of the trajectory of when the Pride Festival and parades came back downtown, how they grew each year as well, pretty significantly. And there was broader awareness of it. There was promotion in our media of it. So I just feel like as we moved later on from the 90s into the 2000s, there was more of a macro level acceptance in our city, a macro level visibility of queerness in our city, which was very reassuring for me. I'm not going to remember the exact year of my first Pride, but it was in Clifton. I remember queuing up at the gazebo in Mount Storm Park. Golly, would that have been 1997, 98? I'm really bad with dates.
Was this Mount Storm or was it Burnett Woods?
Burnett Woods.
Oh, sorry.
So I'll never forget, my first Pride was in Burnett Woods as we all lined up, or as the parade floats and those in the parade queued up at Burnett Woods Park at the gazebo. And then my feeling of kind of exhilaration as the parade started and moved down Ludlow Avenue all the way into Northside. And I kind of caught the bug of feeling not only out, but really, really festive in a large collective way. Just remembered one of my first Pride festival and parade was in Chicago, and that must have been 95. And that was absolutely massive, as we all know. And as a 18-year-old kid, it was like unbelievable to experience all of this queerness en masse. So a couple years later, whatever time frame, when the Pride Festival here in Cincinnati was at Burnett Woods, it was like, we're getting to the, not quite the scale of Chicago, but we're really growing in our queer community and our visibility. So I remember that exhilaration of walking down the street and having people cheer and clap and acknowledge and hug, and the festival afterwards. It was just another magical time. There were a couple of years that I actually kind of day of decided whether I was going to Pride or not. I was having some personal issues. I remember one year, and I just felt kind of more like staying in and reflecting, and just kind of being pensive and peaceful, but still happy. And I was living downtown, and I could actually hear all the cheering and everything. And then a couple of years, it was so super hot outside, I stayed in. But I've gone to Pride, for the most part, for the last 15 years or so. In my workplace, I've always felt accepted as a queer gay man. And it's one of the things I've loved about my job. I've mentioned before, but I love working with diverse people different than me. I love living in neighborhoods and places where people are different than me. And my workplace has always had that diversity and inclusivity and support of each other. So I always felt out at work and felt very supportive and very happy to support the people around me. So it was quite an ecosystem of kindness, caring, allyship, and acceptance of the queer experience. Yeah, when we think about the HIV epidemic, and I'm old enough to remember the deepest stigma on an international level and then a national level, when people were just throwing around the word AIDS all the time before the diagnosis of HIV. I was pretty young, maybe a late teen, so my brain wasn't fully formed yet, but I knew there was something wrong. I knew that there was a need for deeper understanding, kindness, compassion, and caring. And I actually know a few of my favorite colleagues and mentors who helped start what we know as Caracal now, and then a previous iteration that I think developed into Caracol was called Stop AIDS. And in the earliest days of Stop AIDS, I had to stop by the office for something, and I can't remember what it was, but it was an unmarked building. And I had to knock on the door. I think I set a time that I was going to be there and knock on the door. And I just loved the services, the people, and what they were doing. But I remember this sort of immense sadness, not sort of, an immense sadness of the need for it to be secretive. But then over the years have been really proud to see our health services in our communities evolve with great visibility and leading to the idea of everything from prevention of HIV in a very public manner and in a very formal public educational manner, and providing resources to individuals in our community, and then leading to the idea of harm reduction, leading to the idea of mental health issues, risks of suicide, and other toxic problems that trans people face, that queer people face, that many people face. But all that's to say, the organizations in our city and the tilting of the needle to empathy and inclusion and the wealth of resources that we're developing to support, gender-affirming healthcare, helping people with transportation, helping people with harm reduction supplies, treatment for disease and that kind of thing has become a norm, and I've seen the stigma reduce over these years. So I hope that's been more of a collective feeling. But from what I've seen the evolution of the deepest stigma to broader visibility of resources, and those resources developed more inclusivity and kindness and empathy in our communities. Well, when we think about pride changing over the years in relation to the HIV or the AIDS epidemic and the stigma of HIV, I've seen much more activism and visibility of these resources at Pride over the years. We moved from people just simply being stigmatized simply because they're gay, and that image that I reference where our earliest activists, queer activists, wore paper bags over their heads, to Pride festivals definitely embracing the need to destigmatize issues that the queer community faces, and then the resources start popping up. So groups like Caracol really grew their presence, not only in an everyday manner, but at Pride. And now one of the coolest things about Pride is there are so many health and well-being organizations for all kinds of identities. So much more resources for trans people. So I've really seen the growth of that, and I do believe that's helped with broader acceptance. The other thing I've seen in the evolution of Pride in our city is more families, more young people, more parents and grandparents are there, when earlier days it was individual queer people and their friends. But I've seen the allyship grow, the family support grow in our Pride Festival that's very visible. Just this last year's Pride, not only was it absolutely huge along the whole parade route, but I saw a number of t-shirts that adult parents were saying, "I'll hug you like my own child," or something like that. It makes me kind of weepy, but you just saw so much allyship in families. When we think about the Circuit Court of Appeals decision for marriage equality, I'll never forget the time that I was at the Pride Parade that season, and I was sort of over by Race Street, and I saw Jim Ogerbethel in a convertible turning the corner and waving. And it was just this amazing experience. Marriage is not for me. I just have made a decision in my life that marriage is not for me, but I certainly obviously empathize and celebrate and hold in my heart this equality. But it was just such a thrill to actually see the man that made it happen, and knowing his story of his hardships and his bravery and going through everything that they did for our nation and our world, and seeing him. And just the sort of magic of seeing Mr. Ogerbefell as a representative, obviously, of all of this, and his impact and his bravery and his courage and all the hard work he and his partner did for our country and our world. Article 12 was mortifying for me. I was pretty young, and my sort of activist brain hadn't really formed yet. So I was reading about it, keeping up on it. It was really confusing because it was reverse logic, as we all know. So I was just trying to figure it out in my sort of post-adolescent brain. So I didn't get involved at the time, physically or activism-wise, but I kept my finger on the pulse of it. And admired all of the people that I consider heroes today that were activists at the time, and often reflect on the absurdity of the time and how far our city has come along because of this activism and their hard work. It's almost like, did that really happen? Because here we are with our city hall supporting queerness, raising flags, honoring trans people, providing universal health care for the city employees, and that kind of thing, leading the way with the HRC index. As we know, Cincinnati has been a top scoring city for a number of years now on the HRC Equality Index. So systems have changed, and obviously attitudes and collective attitudes have changed, and support from city officials has really grown, developed, and honored all citizens. I think the last couple of prides that I've been to, the festival and parade, and seeing how they've grown, and comparing my experience in the last couple of years to experiences years ago, I'm really, really happy about it. In my personal life, I've just gotten a little more reclusive or not wanting to be around crowds, but I have been in the parade for the past couple of years, and we'll kind of hang out at the festival a little bit. And the corporatization of pride is concerning, but I'm an optimist. I'm concerned about companies sponsoring pride to make money on it, but I just have to acknowledge that there's just a level of awareness and acceptance in the world about it. We live in a world that's driven by money and finance and profits. So if it helps us move along to a larger scale of celebration and inclusion, allyship, love, and a festive feeling, then I need to acknowledge that. But it's not it's sort of a balance that I have to kind of reconcile in my mind. But as to scale, I'm really impressed. And whatever the ingredients are that we've talked about today that have made the Pride Festival and Parade the scale that it is today is pretty amazing. When we look ahead and think about what could improve or enhance or increase our solidarity or strength of our queer communities, we need a space. We need multiple spaces. I love organizations. Treehouse is amazing. Cincinnati Pride is amazing, and we're doing great work. But we need to align and find ways and resources because it's a lot of work to bring a physical facility or space together, but I would love to see a hub where people can gather, where people can have community conversations, where there could be events that offer educational events and support, and opportunities to learn, hear from each other and learn from each other. So yes, Pride is wonderful, and we've talked about how it's grown, but I like to see more of an everyday kind of strength and visibility. And Treehouse and Pride are certainly moving in that direction, and I am so grateful for them and all the work they're doing, and many other groups in the trans community as well. I want to thank them for all of their hard work. I just think as cities grow and change and become more inclusive, we all have to work together to strengthen ourselves and our allyship. One thing I think about intergenerational experiences of the queer communities, and I'm sort of in the middle. I'm a kid I was a teenager in the 80s, and obviously well before social media, but we had the new wave music, the punk rock music, the clubs, and everything, and that was its own era. I believe age is a gift. I'm completely happy that I'm becoming an older person in the queer community, so I have the luxury, and I treasure it, that I can look back and understand some experiences that I had and my friends and allies had, how it changed along the way. But I can't resist, talking about social media and how that's changed for our younger queer people to hopefully bring more inclusivity, strength, safety, and allyship. But as we know, social media can have its own dangers and mental health effects on our mental health as well. So there's no easy answer about the best place to be in the gay community. It's evolving as it is. But I think I just want to kind of say how fortunate I feel that I'm sort of in the middle of this transition from being more secretive, stigmatized communities to I'm seeing folks holding hands on the street nowadays, expressing themselves, sharing our pronouns and our gender identity, and growing our inclusiveness. We've got a ways to go. My heart just aches about the dangers that many people face. So we need to look at ways to eliminate the feeling of lack of safety that many of our queer friends and allies feel. I've experienced it in the past. I think it's kind of morphed and changed in its intensity and impact on people. So we have a lot of work to do, but I'm really fortunate to see sort of how things have changed, and how we can grow together as a community. So I'm optimistic about the future, but I acknowledge the challenges that we have.